June 13, 2025, marked yet another tragic chapter in America's long and contentious history with capital punishment. South Carolina executed 56-year-old Stephen Stanko, a man whose life had once been filled with promise but had taken a violent and horrific turn. His name would forever be linked to the brutal murder of his girlfriend, Christina, and the sexual assault of her 15-year-old daughter, Laura.
How old are you?
15. I tried to put up a fight. I tried. I really did.
Did you see who did it?
Yeah. With my mom's boyfriend.
Stanko's crimes did not stop there. He also murdered his friend Henry, adding yet another life lost to his reign of terror. In 2005, Stanko's crimes shook the community to its core, and the ripples of his actions would haunt the victims' families for years to come. The crime was not just an act of violence, it was the culmination of a life that spiraled into darkness. Stanko was once described as a person with potential, but his choices led him down a destructive path. The brutality of his actions seemed incomprehensible, and the damage he caused was irreversible. After years of legal battles and multiple appeals, the state of South Carolina moved forward with his execution. Stanko, however, made a final decision of his own. As the day of his execution approached, he chose to face the lethal injection, rejecting the other execution methods available in the state, such as the electric chair and firing squad. His choice of lethal injection was, in many ways, his last act of control. It was swift, clinical, and offered little room for the emotional weight of his actions to be reflected in the process. But, as the lethal injection entered his veins, it marked the end of his journey, a journey that had started with promise but ended in irrevocable destruction. The contrast between Stanko's final meal and the nature of his crimes was stark. He requested a meal so elaborate it could have come from the finest restaurant: fried fish, shrimp, crab cakes, baked potato, fried okra, cherry pie, banana pudding, and sweet tea. It was an unusual request, given the horrors he had committed. His final meal was a fleeting moment of indulgence, almost out of place in a life defined by pain and violence. But perhaps it was an attempt to grasp for something he had never fully understood: the sweetness of life, something that had been taken from his victims so long ago. The most emotional moment of Stanko's execution, however, was his final words. As the state prepared to carry out the sentence, Stanko spoke with a deep sense of remorse. "Once I am gone, I hope that Christina, Laura's family, and Henry's family can all forgive me. The execution may help them. Forgiveness will heal them." In those words, Stanko seemed to acknowledge the vastness of his crimes, the lives he had destroyed, the families he had shattered. It was an attempt at redemption, a final hope that his death could somehow offer the victims a measure of peace. For some, Stanko's words might have been a small gesture of closure, a final plea for forgiveness. But for others, no amount of regret could undo the pain he had caused. The scars left behind by his violent actions would linger long after his death. Stanko's execution was not just a reflection on his life, but a meditation on forgiveness, justice, and the long-reaching consequences of violent crime. It reminded us that the path to redemption is often fraught with obstacles, and that some wounds can never truly be healed, no matter how deep the remorse. In the end, Stephen Stanko's story was a tragedy, not just for him, but for the families he had forever changed. His execution was one more reminder of the complexities of justice and the weight of the choices we make in life. Anthony Wainwright, Florida. On June 10, 2025, Rayford, Florida, was the site of a somber and haunting moment as 51-year-old Anthony Wainwright was led to his execution. Wainwright had spent more than 3 decades on death row for the kidnapping, rape, and brutal murder of 23-year-old Carmen Gayhart in 1994. On that fateful day, Wainwright had snatched Gayhart from a convenience store, forced her into his car, and drove her to a remote location. There, he raped her and then shot her in the head, leaving her lifeless body behind. His crime, horrific in its brutality, shocked the community and left Gayhart's family devastated. For over 30 years, Wainwright's case went through numerous appeals, but in the end, the justice system moved forward with his execution. As he stood at the precipice of death, the eyes of many were focused on this man, whose actions had forever changed the course of several lives. Despite the years of legal battles, Wainwright's final moments were filled with silence. His last meal was not disclosed to the public, and, according to prison officials, he had no last words. There was no public statement, no remorse or final reflection offered before the lethal injection was administered. The cold, methodical process of the execution unfolded quietly, leaving only a sense of finality. As the drugs flowed through his veins, Wainwright's life came to an end. His execution did not bring the closure that many had hoped for. Instead, it left a lingering sense of sorrow and a reminder of the deep scars left by his actions. For the victim's family, there would be no solace in his death, just the painful reality that nothing could undo the horror that had been wrought 30 years ago. Wainwright's death was a moment that marked the conclusion of one chapter in the long history of capital punishment in America, but for many, it also raised questions about justice. Was this truly an act of justice, or was it merely vengeance? In the end, Wainwright's life, like the lives of others executed in the months and years that followed, would be remembered not just for the crime he committed, but for the silence that marked his final moments. Gregory Hunt, Alabama. Just minutes after Anthony Wainwright was executed across the southern United States, another man was facing the end of his life. Gregory Hunt, convicted of the brutal bludgeoning death of Karen Lane, was put to death in Alabama on the same day, June 10, 2025. What set this execution apart, however, was the method chosen, nitrogen gas hypoxia, a relatively new method that had been approved by the state. Alabama had decided that Hunt would be the first person executed using this method, and its chilling quietness would leave an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. Hunt's crime had taken place in 1988 when, after a volatile relationship with Karen Lane, he struck her multiple times with a blunt object, killing her in cold blood. His actions left Lane's family shattered and left an indelible stain on his own life. Hunt's path to the execution chamber was long, filled with numerous legal maneuvers and appeals that stretched over decades. But on the night of June 10, 2025, there would be no words of regret, no final meal publicly disclosed, and no family at his side. Instead, as Hunt was strapped into the execution chamber, the process of nitrogen gas hypoxia would begin. Unlike lethal injection, nitrogen gas hypoxia involves the inhalation of nitrogen, which deprives the body of oxygen, leading to an agonizing, yet swift, death. Hunt's execution passed without the emotional intensity that often accompanies such events. His death was executed in silence, the method itself leaving little room for reflection or catharsis. No final words came from him, and there was no public acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. Hunt's fate was sealed, and as the gas flowed through the chamber, his life was extinguished. The quiet and undramatic nature of the execution contrasted sharply with the violent acts he had committed years earlier. The execution of Gregory Hunt by nitrogen gas hypoxia raised significant questions about the nature of capital punishment. The method's stark silence made the act seem eerily detached, almost as if the system had removed any emotional resonance from the death of a man. In the end, Hunt's execution was not marked by reflection, remorse, or closure. It was, instead, a grim, quiet conclusion to the life of a man who had committed a heinous crime, leaving the public with a stark reminder of the cold reality of the death penalty. John Fitzgerald Hansen, Oklahoma. 2 days after Gregory Hunt's execution, June 12, 2025, saw the end of John Fitzgerald Hansen's life in Oklahoma. Hansen had been convicted of the 1999 murder of a woman in Tulsa, a crime that had left the city shaken. Hansen, who had been living under the weight of his crime for over 2 decades, was finally brought to the execution chamber, where the state's lethal injection protocol would be used to put him to death. Throughout his years on death row, Hansen had filed numerous appeals, but his attempts to avoid the inevitable were unsuccessful. His crime, while not as publicized as others, was nonetheless brutal. Hansen had murdered the woman in cold blood, leaving behind a community that would forever remember the violence that had been inflicted. As the time for his execution arrived, Hansen's demeanor was calm, though he had not spoken publicly in years. His final meal, like many others, was kept confidential, and his last words, if he had any, were not revealed. When the lethal injection began, Hansen said nothing. The process was clinical and swift, a cold and methodical end to a man who had spent the last 2 decades seeking to avoid the moment that had now come. The absence of words, the lack of any final message, left the execution devoid of the emotional weight that often accompanies such moments. For the family of the victim, there was no catharsis to be found in his death. Instead, it was just another reminder that the justice system had done what it set out to do, but it would not undo the harm that had been caused so many years ago. The quiet, emotionless nature of Hansen's execution reflected the desensitizing effect that years on death row can have, not only on the prisoner but on society itself. Thomas Lee Godinez, Florida. On June 24, 2025, in Florida, Thomas Lee Godinez was executed for the 1995 rape and murder of Michelle McGrath. Godinez had stalked McGrath as she walked home from a nightclub, assaulted her, and left her to die in a stairwell. The brutality of his crime left her family in agony, and for 30 years, Godinez lived under the shadow of death, waiting for the inevitable day when his fate would be sealed. Like so many others on death row, Godinez had filed appeals over the years, trying to avoid the moment that had finally come. But by 6:15 p.m. on June 24th, the state had made its decision. Godinez was put to death by lethal injection. The details of his final meal and last words were kept private, leaving the public with little insight into his thoughts in his final moments. For Godinez's victims, there would be no real justice in his death. His execution was a grim reminder of the consequences of his actions, but it did little to heal the deep wounds left in the wake of his crime. His death was another chapter in the ongoing debate about the death penalty, and whether it truly brings closure to the families of victims or simply serves as another act of vengeance. Richard Gerald Jordan, Mississippi. June 25, 2025, saw the end of Mississippi's longest-serving death row inmate. Richard Gerald Jordan, 78 years old, had spent 49 years awaiting execution. In 1976, Jordan had kidnapped and killed 34-year-old Edwina Martyr during a botched ransom attempt. His crime had set off a lengthy legal battle that stretched on for nearly 5 decades, drawing attention to the flaws in the justice system. Jordan's final meal and last words were not disclosed to the public. Lawyers had argued that Jordan suffered from PTSD due to his service in Vietnam, and there were those who believed that his prolonged time on death row had deeply affected his mental state. Despite these arguments, the state moved forward with his execution. At nightfall, Richard Gerald Jordan was executed, marking the end of Mississippi's longest death row saga. The execution raised questions about the efficacy and morality of the death penalty, especially when dealing with cases that spanned so many years. Jordan's story was a reminder of the complexities and the emotional toll of capital punishment, and of the deep scars left in its wake. The month of June 2025 saw the end of 6 lives, each marked by a brutal crime and a long wait for justice. Each man had committed heinous acts, but their deaths raised questions about the meaning of justice itself. Was the execution of these men an act of justice or vengeance? For the victims' families, the executions may have brought some measure of closure, but for the rest of society, the shadow of these deaths would continue to loom large. Behind every execution, there is a story, one that reflects the deep complexities of life, death, and the justice system itself.